Hi there, and welcome to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mowry of Drea Renee Knits, and let's answer some questions. Today I am wearing Shifty, my finally released Shifty cardi. This has been in the making for so long. I had requests for the sweater right after releasing Shifty, which was 4 years ago, I think. So this has been in the making for a long time, and there was lots of little things to work out along the way. So it took me a little while, but it is finally out into the world. So that is what I'm wearing today. Mine is knit up in Spin Cycle dyed in the wool, and I thought I would just chat a little bit about this sweater. So unlike the rest of the Shift series, I have a scale on my desk, and I know I'm going to keep leaning on this, and it's going to go beep throughout the entire time. So I'm going to move it. So the rest of the Shift series uses mosaic color work where you slip stitches and you're only ever using one strand of yarn at a time. After doing a number of swatching experiments with cutting through my mosaic knitting, I found in my personal experience that mosaic knitting does not actually enjoy being cut through. So I scratched that idea and I had to think of how I could make this sweater work without mosaic knitting if I was going to knit it in the round. The other option would be to knit it flat. And the reason I chose not to knit it flat is because I am using these beautiful, slow color changing yarns that, wish I had a skein, but I do over here. So, actually, I'll grab a little ball of it too. So in a yarn like Spin Cycle, and this would be similar to hand spun, and if it was spun fractal, so kind of something like this, which here is another, this technically isn't fractal, but kind of similar idea. Anyways, I'm getting myself distracted. So the thing with this yarn is that it slowly changes color throughout the skein, and that's actually what kind of makes it so fun. And you have all this really interesting color stuff that happens without having to do it yourself. You could absolutely come up with a similar look using odds and ends from your stash, where you could create your own kind of gradient, maybe pick a solid color for the main color, and then just use odds and ends to create your own gradient in your sweater. But it is very handy sometimes when the yarn just does it for you. So with this kind of yarn, and when it is changing color for you, if you work it back and forth over a larger circumference, what can end up happening is that instead of looking like stripes, like in my cardigan, it will be shifted off. So because you're working this row back and then forth, that color is going to change throughout, and it won't end up lining up like this anymore. It'll be more like this. And you can see that when you button up your cardigan. Now, it might not be a huge deal. Some people, it might not have bothered, but it can also be more extreme depending on the size that you're knitting. And so I wanted to attempt to reduce that as much as possible, and I knew the way to do that would be to steek it. So for me, steeking was what had to be done. And mosaic did not like to be steeked, so stranded color work was the answer to my question. So anyways, this is a stranded color work sweater. I still kept the original texture of the whole Shift series intact with purling the color work every other round, and that's how you get this garter stitch texture on a stockinette stitch background. And that's kind of one of the things that makes the Shift series so interesting, is that texture and that 3D kind of what have you. So what else? It's knit from the top down, and it's a cardigan. And it's stranded, and it's steeked. Oh, let's talk a little bit about steeking, because I knew that this would end up being some people's first steeking project. And I know that it can feel scary to cut into your knitting, because it's like kind of the last thing you want to do when you've never done it. So One thing that really helped me not feel anxious as I steeked was knowing that sweaters do not want to unravel, knits do not want to unravel horizontally across a row. They want to drop down when they unravel. So if you think like about a dropped stitch that will just kind of unzip, that is how sweaters want to unravel. They don't just want to go across like this. So when you think about cutting into your sweater, even if you didn't reinforce it, which you will most likely, in this sweater I recommend it. So even if you did not reinforce it, it would only unravel so far. So with that in mind, I also did a larger steek column than I have in the past. So the steek column for this sweater uses 7 stitches. In the past, I've done 5. You can kind of do whatever steek column you prefer, but I liked the 7 stitches. One, because it was a similar width to the button band. So this way you can still try the sweater on as you knit, which we love especially about top-down sweaters, is to try it on and make sure that you like how everything's fitting, especially when it's one that you're gonna cut into, because once you've cut into it, you can't really unravel it. So I liked that the steek column was a similar width as that button band was going to end up being, so I could try it on along the way. And also by having it be a little bit wider, again, once you cut, it doesn't really want to travel to the side like that. And so I felt like giving it a little bit of extra width would also help people feel more comfortable with cutting into their knit. For the sweater, I did use dyed in the wool, which is a superwash yarn. And some people are like, don't steek with superwash yarn. I have steeked with superwash yarn many times, and I've never had a problem. That being said, the whole reason people recommend using a non-superwash yarn is because non-superwash yarn is stickier and grippier, and it will kind of grip onto itself. And over time, it will even kind of felt together, strengthening that steek area so that you're not going to see any kind of unraveling or pulling over time. So I wanted to say, woo, I am trying to keep all my thoughts straight because there's a few things that I wanted to be like, oh, I should mention this. So I use dyed in the wool. I am not afraid to steek this yarn. I've had great results with it in multiple sweaters. But if you're like, I don't know about that, you can absolutely use a non-superwash yarn. If you want to stick with the spin cycle, slow color change look, then you could use Nocturne. That is their other yarn that is really similar to dyed in the wool, but they dye it on a gray base. And so it's a little darker and moodier, and it's non-superwash. So if you were like, I just feel more comfortable, you could even do Nocturne as the main color. So the majority of it is knit in a non-superwash, and then still use dyed in the wool for the actual color work if you wanted to. But I just wanted to say that in regards to if you're feeling nervous about like, oh, can I use a superwash? You know, I've not had any problem. But another thing to keep in mind, again, if you are using superwash or not, and you just happen to have a sewing machine handy, but if you are feeling nervous, maybe you're using kind of a slippery yarn and you're like, oh, I don't know how this is going to do, then you could try doing a sewn reinforcement instead of a crochet reinforcement. So for most of my sweaters I've steeked, I've done a crochet reinforcement. But for this sweater, I was like, you know what? My sewing machine lives out over there, happily hanging out, because I try to sew fairly regularly. And so I was like, I'm just going to do a sewn reinforcement. So what I did is in the area that I needed to reinforce, I just used my zigzag stitch and went over that line of stitches on both sides of my steek column. And it works great. And it does a really good job of trapping that yarn because it's going over it. Like that's when I finish a weaving project, if I'm doing, let's say, hand towels, then I use my zigzag stitch on my sewing machine before hemming it to make sure that everything will not unravel. And after that, you're also going to, so then you're left with these, you've cut down the middle and you're left with a little column on each side of that steek. And you have to do something with that. So you're going to pick up stitches inside of it. And so what you generally do is you just fold it back. Hopefully you can kind of see from here. You just fold it in, and I just whip stitch it down. I just sew it down. And I think I used my main color to do that. Now, if you are one of those people that is clever and not, I don't know, distracted by all the other things that you want to make, like myself, you could even put a little ribbon to cover. Some people will put a cute little ribbon that they'll sew into their sweater to cover their steek where they sewed it in, and that can be really pretty too. But I've just never, I always have the best intentions, but I'm on to the next thing, you know? So I also feel like once you folded that over and whip stitched it in, again, you're securing all those little ends down. They're not naturally going to want to pop out and try to and escape. So it's going to be okay. All that to say, you can do it. You can steek. But there is some extra information about this sweater. It is long sleeved. I'm really short-waisted, so I consider this a long sweater, and most of my testers did too. In fact, some of them even decided to cut out the final repeat for a more cropped sweater. It's really easy to crop or add length to because it's knit top down. So there you go. There's some information on the Shifty. You can get it on my website, DreaReneeKnits.com, or you can get it over in my Ravelry shop on Ravelry. And of course, I will link below to both of those pattern pages. All right, let's get into some questions. I'm hoping you can give me some guidance about swatching. I'm planning to make a weekender, and I've tried a few yarn and needle combos. In the yarn I like best, a worsted wool alpaca blend, I had to go down to a 4.5 millimeter to get gauge, even though the pattern calls for a 5.5. I like the fabric I made with my swatch. Is it possible to change needle sizes too much when getting gauge, or am I okay as long as my gauge matches the pattern and I like my fabric? So you got it exactly right. As long as you have gauge, so you know that your dimensions will turn out how they are supposed to, and you like that fabric, that's all that matters. There's no such thing as changing too many needle sizes as long as you like the fabric and it's going to get you gauge. And that's not that many needle sizes to have to change. So that was a 5.5 is what's called for, and you're using a 4.5. So for those not using the metric system, that is, the pattern calls for a 9 and they're going to use a 7, and that's 100% fine. So all that matters is you like that fabric. And I just want to also say, make sure you wet block that swatch if you haven't already, because of that alpaca. The alpaca might make that swatch grow more than you might think. So if you haven't blocked your swatch, which I'm sure you have, just something to think about is that that alpaca is going to affect the growth of those stitches. So I don't know what the percentage is of how much alpaca is in there, but it's just nice to know that doesn't generally have as much bounce back as wool does. All right, next question. You have mentioned before that you soak your knitted garments in warm or even hot water when washing or blocking them. Is this safe for even non-superwash garments? How warm or hot do you let the water get? Can you talk more about the benefits of doing high temp water? Is it just about getting them cleaner, or is it about letting the yarn bloom more? Is there any yarn content that you would only do cool water with? So let's kind of go through this one by one. Is this safe for even non-superwash garments? As long as you don't mess around with that knit in that hot water, I believe it is safe. Felting isn't generally going to occur without shock or agitation. So what you don't want to do is extreme temperature changes with a non-superwash yarn. So you don't want to go from that really, really hot water into really, really cold water. And I can't remember if it's only one direction that matters, like hot to cold or cold to hot. But anyways, don't do extreme temperature changes with that yarn because that can felt it. And agitation is the other thing that's going to felt your yarn. Otherwise, if you are just putting that yarn into that knit into hot water, or yarn, because I do the same thing with my hand spun, into hot water, and then you don't touch it and you just leave it there till that water's cool, it's not going to felt. I've never had anything felt. So absolutely, I do that with my non-superwash knits. And how warm or hot do you let the water get? I let it get as hot as my tap goes. So I just turn it all the way to hot and fill up the sink. And again, I just plop the knit in there. If I touch it at all, it's a gentle like hand on top just to get it below the surface of the water. But I absolutely am not agitating it in any way. And I do always throw some wool wash in there as well. And the reason I do it honestly is because I do think it blooms better. So you will see if you look at pre-blocked knit fabric and post-blocked, generally the pre-blocked one is going to show more imperfections. Everything's a little bit thinner, maybe a little bit more open, a little bit more like, ugh. And then you wet block it and it all just relaxes. And that yarn puffs up and it fills everything in and it looks so much more even, and cables pop and lace opens and color work smooths out, and it's just magic. So I find that I get a better result when I do use hot water. Again, I leave it in there until that water is completely cool to the touch. So I leave it in there for an hour or a couple hours. I just forget about it until, a lot of times I try to do it in the morning, and then towards the end of my work day is when I'll pull everything out to lay flat to dry. And is there any yarn content that you would only do cool water with? For me, no, not yarn content, but colors, yes. I have, as I think I've said on here before, I've only ever had color bleeding occur once for me. So that is the only time I would be cautious about using hot water, because hot water, there's a higher chance of that color bleeding in hot water than in cold water. Basically, hot water opens the cuticle on those individual hairs and fibers from an animal, and cold water closes it. And so if I want to try to reduce any color bleeding that might happen, I am going to choose cold water over hot water. And again, just to kind of circle back to the beginning, when dyers dye yarn, they're doing it in very hot water. So if that also kind of helps set your mind at ease, regardless of if it's superwash or non-superwash, generally that includes some hot water in the process. So there you go. Just to recap what I do for blocking, I basically put my tap on hot, add a little wool wash, throw my knit in there or my hand spun yarn, and then I just forget about it until the water's cool, and then I just squeeze it out in some towels until I get it as dry as I can, as much moisture as I can out of there, and then I just lay it flat to dry or hang it up if it's yarn. All right, let's see, next question. Oh, this is about the Shifty cardigan. I saw that the cardigan has a higher neck. It has a crew neck. And I'm more of a V-neck fan myself, but being the adventurous newbie that I am, I have no idea how to change the neck of a cardigan. Certainly not a cardigan that you have to stab, and by that I think they mean steek. Do you have any tips? So generally speaking, all you would need to do to turn this into a V-neck is you would need to, you know, I kind of forgot when I picked this question that this is top down. So it is actually more involved than, at first I was like, that wouldn't be that bad of a mod, but it is going to be more involved, because what you would do is you would need to cast on less stitches. Yeah, so I don't think I'd recommend because basically the neck shaping in here is in the collar so that it does not disrupt the color work. So you can see that the collar is a bit shorter here, and then in the back it's longer so that it sits a little nicer around our neck and doesn't like do like a total anyways, so right out the gate, the issue you're going to run into is for a steeked sweater like this, what you would need to do if you wanted it to be a V-neck and it's worked from the top down is you would need to cast on less stitches, because what you would want to do is then you would increase to the correct stitch count all along that steek band. So you wouldn't be able to see it. I'm doing this, but in your knitting, you would have this really, really tiny hole. So you also wouldn't be able to try it on as you go because your neck hole would be like really little, and because you're starting with less stitches to create that opening. And then what you would do is increase on either side of that steek column until you achieved the correct amount. You know, by the time, it depends on how deep you want your V-neck. Let's say you wanted it around the same time you're going to separate So it would be trickier because you'd be messing with a lot of stuff up here. If it were from the bottom up, it would be a little more simple, because basically what you would do is when you want to start that V-neck, you would just start decreasing along that steek column. Again, you're going to end up with a little tiny neck hole, but then once you cut it open, that would open up. And so what I would do is I wouldn't even do the collar knit with the body. I would actually bind off, cut it open, and then I would pick up for my button band all the way around instead of There's a lot of sound effects. Can't promise it made a lot of sense. But that one is a little bit trickier to modify because you are going to have to mess with all this up here. So, okay. Next question. I'm wondering about the etiquette legality regarding selling your knit finished objects as a side project. Is this only okay if you designed the pattern of the knit? Is it okay to knit up a pattern that someone else designed and sell the FO without their consent or sharing the profit? Would never want to infringe upon a copyright or break community etiquette, but it would be a fun little side hustle to sell some fun items on Etsy or at farmers markets. So I have gotten this question a few times, and I also have noticed an uptick in people selling finished objects for my patterns on Etsy. So if you are doing that, please don't. Basically, it completely depends on that designer and their copyright. In my copyright, it very specifically states that you're not allowed to sell finished items from my patterns. In general, a good way to know if that designer would be okay with you selling finished items is they will state it. And a lot of times, I've seen this more so with sewing pattern designers than with knitwear designers, but they'll actually sell a license. So you pay a fee and then you get to make the object from that pattern and sell it yourself if you would like to. It's can't remember exactly what it's called, a wholesale license or something, I don't know. But if there's no permission given, don't assume you can. Definitely at least reach out, but a lot of times it'll be stated right in the copyright. So go read the copyright. And if you can't find anything on it, I would definitely recommend asking that designer before you go sell things from their patterns. So in regards to my patterns, I do not give permission to sell finished items from my patterns. So please don't. And thank you for respecting my copyright. Next question. I recently made a top-down circular yoke. Sorry, I'm just going to do a little quick sip of this. Sweater that has little to no intended ease and find it so uncomfortable. It's beautiful, but the sleeves are too snug and they pull the rest of the sweater into unnatural positions, no matter how aggressively I block it. Would you suggest reknitting the sleeves at a larger gauge? I don't have any spare yarn, so would I lose some length? I'm not averse to frogging entirely. So I would recommend, it sounds like that's your only fit issue is the sleeves. And I'm not sure how, did you say anywhere what direction? Yeah, top down. So that to me is what I would try before just frogging the whole sweater. I would try taking out those sleeves. If it's just that the sleeves are too tight, then that could be a really easy fix. First of all, once you unravel those sleeves, you could pick up some additional stitches underneath the underarm to give you a little more width up in the bicep. And then what I would do is I would go up 1 to 2 needle sizes. A couple years ago, I actually started recommending going up a needle size for sleeves in a lot of my patterns, because what I found across the board, generally speaking, most people knit tighter in small circumference knitting than they do in large circumference knitting. Their gauge just tightens up. And most of us don't think to recheck our gauge when we finish the body and we move on to the sleeves. And it can usually be a pretty large discrepancy. So always make sure that your gauge hasn't changed between your sleeves and your body. And if it has, I do recommend changing needle size to accommodate that change. So that you're staying even throughout the entire project. And so that's what I would do. I would unravel the sleeve, and I would just start with one to make sure that you'll like how it looks. But I would unravel, I would consider adding a few extra stitches in that underarm, especially it didn't sound like there was any all over patterning that would get messed up. And just try going up a needle size or two, and that might be all the fix you need. You will lose some length if you don't have any extra yarn, but you could totally do either bracelet length has become my new favorite. I actually really like when a sweater ends kind of right around my wrist bone here, because I just find it doesn't get in my way. But otherwise, a 3/4 length would look really nice, even just below the elbow. You know, whatever you like. But I think that that's a great solution. And I would start there to try and see if you can't save that sweater and have it be one that you love. And definitely we want our clothing to be comfortable. So making it more comfortable is key. All right. I think that's all the questions. And I don't really have any show and tell today. Oh, you know what I could show you is, oh, I don't know. It must have been, it was probably a year, almost exactly a year ago. I did an episode on my spinning journal and I had switched. So I had started a new one. This is it. And I did this kind of, I had my whole layout, how I liked to do it. Let's see if I can kind of find an example. Where I would just, you know, I decided, okay, what's the important information that I want in here? And I started doing this journal and it was great. But one of the things that I've always struggled with is, especially when it comes to crafts, I like having a visual so I can remember what exactly did that yarn look like that I spun or the thing I sewed. So for my sewing journal, which I also happen to have right here, I've shown it to y'all before, but don't mind me just dropping things on the floor. But I tend to do like little Polaroids so that I know, oh yeah, this is what I made. The thing with Polaroids is they're not great. What would you call that? You can't see things that well. Sorry, I'm not gonna remember my word right now. But you know, they're a little blurry, they're a little fuzzy, you can't see all the details. And so it's fine for my sewing journal. I don't find that I mind that. But for my spinning journal, I want to see the true color of that yarn, especially when I spin something that has so much variation in it. You know, I really want to know, okay, what's going on in there? What yarns did I use? I also generally take pictures along the way. I love to open up a braid or take a picture of just the braid so that I know, okay, if I had another braid that was similar with the color application, now I kind of have an idea of what that would turn out if I spun it the same way. So I know that this may cause a little controversy because it did for me internally. But I switched to a digital journal. And at first I felt like I try really hard to just like get away from the screens where I can. And I've always been a pen and notebook person. I just love a good pen. I love a good notebook. But I was like, you know, I think that I will utilize it more and I can kind of keep track better. So this week, that's kind of been my project. It has been my project of trying to come up with my new little journal. I just had the problem with, again, all this technology is now like, I've got people texting me on my iPad. It's dinging. It's not supposed to ding right now. Anyways, okay. So I thought I would show it because I did have a question the other day of how I do my little spinning journal. So this is how I'm doing it now. Hopefully you can see this okay. Again, I never checked last week to see if it flips. So if this is all backwards for you, sorry about that. So this is just super simple. That is how I have it laid out. So I title it, this happens to be the colorway name, Toasted Coconut. I do the date started, the date finished, the fiber source, fiber content, colorway. I then do color notes because a lot of times the name of the colorway doesn't really describe the color. So then I usually write out like, these are the colors that are in here. I do like to do a pre-spun weight. I don't know why, I guess for fun. And then I do my spinning plan. Fiber prep, how is the fiber prepared or how am I preparing it? Which wheel of mine I'm spinning it on, the whirl size, what kind of drafting style I'm using. And then I also do all of my like post notes of plies, reps per inch. You could also do twists per inch. You could do your grist. I do my finished weight, finished yardage, notes, the outcome of it, and then what I use it for. So I have that on one page, and then on the next page, isn't it pretty? So here I can put all of my little photos that I take along the way. So this is a skein I haven't used yet, so it just shows that. But let me take a little peek here and I'll see if I can show you one where I've then used it in a project. So for this one, for example, wow. Here is one I did for Olive. So that is the yarn before I spun it, the finished yarn, and then Olive wearing her cowl. And I'll even go through, some even have more pictures because I was a little bit photo happy while spinning one. Sometimes they have a picture of me at the wheel spinning them. Like this one was my first fractal spin and my first hand spun socks. So there's the braid on my wheel, the finished yarn, knitting while Olive does her school from home during the pandemic, and the finished socks. So I'm loving it. I have to say, I really was so skeptical because, again, I like getting away from technology, and I don't necessarily want to introduce more of it into my life, but I also know I'll keep this up better. And I love having all the references, all the photos. You can also link. So the app I use is GoodNotes that my friend Rachel from Ritual Dyes turned me on to. And that's what I'm doing it in. And I love that I can also link. So let's say it was a yarn or a farm or something that I was like, oh, I want to make sure I remember this. You can add in hyperlinks and link straight to it. I can send a copy of it. Anyways, so far so good. But I know some of you are probably like, no, no, keep the notebook. But it's working for me right now. Now I'm like, ooh, do I do this for my sewing journal? I don't think I'll start designing in there. I've been doing some of my design ideas in there, but I don't think it would work for me for how I design. I very much design in these little notebooks. And I don't know if I could get away from that. So this will be where I get my notebook and pen kicks. Will be with my design with. All right, I'm just rambling now. So I guess that's all I've got for show and tell. So I guess I'll end this here. I hope that y'all have a great weekend. I hope you get to make something. And I hope to see you back here next weekend. Bye.